الحمد لله ثم الحمد لله. يقول المؤلف رحمه الله: وعن أبي عبد الرحمن عبد الله بن عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنهما قال: سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول. Narrated by Abu Abdul Rahman, Abdullah ibn Umar. Abdullah, the son of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhuma, he said, I heard Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam saying, انطلق ثلاثة نفر ممن كان قبلكم حتى آواهم المبيت إلى غار فدخلوا. There were three men amongst those who came before you, and before the time of the Sahaba and so forth. They set out one night until they came and reached a cave. And so they entered this cave. They entered the cave to spend the night in the cave. And what happened? فَانْحَدَرَتْ صَخْرَةٌ مِّنَ الْجَبَلِ فَسَدَّتْ عَلَيْهِمُ الْغَارِ. A rock fell down from the mountain and blocked the entrance to the cave. فقالوا إنه لا ينجيكم من هذه الصخرة إلا أن تدعوا الله بصالح أعمالكم. So they said to each other, nothing will save you from this unless you pray to Allah. You supplicate to Allah by virtue of a righteous deed that you have done. Pray to Allah Azza wa Jal on account of some good deed that you did. And so these men, they started to make dua. And they spoke to Allah Azza wa Jal. So I'm going to skip the Arabic because it is a bit lengthy. So the first man, he said, Oh Allah, I had parents who were old, elderly parents. And I used to offer them milk before any of my children or slaves. So this man, he would go out, collect milk from his goats and sheep, bring them home, but he would never feed his family until after he's fed his parents. So he said, one day I went far away. Because he was out working in the fields, searching and grazing and so forth, I could not get back except after they had slept. When I milked as usual and brought the drink, I found them asleep. So he says, I hated to disturb them and also disliked to give them milk before I gave my own children. Because this was how important and his beloved his parents were to him, that nobody should eat until his parents have eaten. He says, my children were crying out of hunger at my feet, but I waited with a bowl in my hand for them to wake up. When they awoke at dawn, they drank from this milk. So the man then says, Oh Allah. So this was his deed. This was his righteous deed. He then prays to Allah and he says, Oh Allah, if I did this to seek your pleasure, then deliver us from this distress caused by the rock. Then save us from this predicament that we are in. So the rock moved slightly, but not enough for them to escape. The second man, he then makes dua and he says, Oh Allah, I had a cousin, Ibnatu Ammin, a daughter of my uncle, my Ammi, whom I loved more than anyone else. One narration of the Hadith says, he says, more than a man, any other man could possibly love a woman. This is how much I desired this cousin of mine. He says, I wanted to have sexual relations with her, but she refused. Until she became in a state of difficulty. There was a year of famine. So she approached me for help. I gave her 120 dinars, but on condition that she would give herself to me. So she agreed out of desperation. And he says, when we got together, she said, Ittaqillah. One narration says, he was laying with her, about to fulfill an act of zina. And she says to him, Fear Allah. And Ibn Uthaymin rahimahullah, he says on this point, it's like she said this from the deepness, the depth of her heart. And this struck him in the depth of his heart. One word, fear Allah, ittaqillah. And do not break the seal unlawfully, she said to him. And so I moved away from her, in spite of the fact that I loved her most passionately. And I let her keep the money I had given her. Oh Allah, if I did that to seek your pleasure, then remove the distress we are in. So the rock moved aside a bit, but not enough for them to escape. The third man, he says, Oh Allah, I hired some laborers. I have people working for me. And I paid them their wages except for one of them, because he departed without taking his due. So let's say, mathalan, I owed him £100 and he left before I could pay him. So I invested his money in business and the business prospered greatly. After a long time, he came to me and he said, "O slave of Allah, pay me my dues. Where's my £100? And this man, he said, all that you see is yours. Camels, goats, slaves. That £100 has now grown to what is worth maybe thousands and thousands. He said, O slave of Allah, don't mock me. This is not what I left with you. Don't mock me. And he said, I assured him that I'm not joking. So he took all the things and he went away. And he spared nothing. O Allah, if I did this seeking your pleasure, then relieve us of this distress. So the rock moved aside and they left, walking freely. This hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. What are the benefits we can get from this narration? There's a few, and the most important one, and the reason the author has brought it into this chapter, is the virtue of al-ikhlas, sincerity towards Allah. These men, they did acts of worship, great things. And Allah saved them on account of these deeds because they were done sincerely for His sake. And when they made dua, they said, Oh Allah, if I did this sincerely for you, seeking your pleasure alone, seeking your face alone, then relieve us. This proves that they were sincere. So it's on account of their sincerity that Allah saved them. Hence, when we have ikhlas in our deeds, Allah will save us. Allah will relieve us of distress and difficulty and calamities. As for when there's deeds with showing off, seeking reputations, no ikhlas, then this doesn't benefit us at all. This is like the foam that is blown away. Right? Another virtue of this hadith is the virtue of birrul walidain. The importance of being righteous to one's parents. Honoring them before anyone else. Loving them more than anyone else after Allah and His Messenger. Preferring them to our own needs and wants. This is a great virtue. And this is one of the greatest deeds in Al-Islam. And also, carrying their hardships upon us. If they have any difficulties, we should bear it upon us like they bared our difficulties when we were smaller. Another benefit is fadilatul iffa an zina, the virtue of staying pure. The benefit and the grace of staying pure and free from any form of zina. That if a person, he remains pure while he is able to fall into zina. A person has the ability to do zina if he wants to, but he still keeps himself chaste and pure, then this is from the greatest of deeds. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned about the 7 who will be shaded under the shade of Allah on that day when there's no shade, but His shade is a man who is invited by a woman who is beautiful and has status, and he says, Inni akhafullah. And he's not interested on account that he is what? Fearful of Allah Azza wa Jal. The last benefit is the virtue of fulfilling one's amana. Fulfilling your responsibilities. The third man could have easily given the £100 and kept everything else for himself. But he knew, all of this doesn't belong to me. He was truthful to himself, truthful to Allah, and truthful to the person, and he gave him everything. Fulfilled his amana, his covenant, his contract. This is something that is extremely important in Al-Islam. And of course, that Allah Azza wa Jalla is Sami'ud Dua. Allah hears our du'as. And He's able to do whatever He wants. There's nothing impossible for Him. Allah did not send a machine to move the rock. He did not send men to push the rock. He moved the rock on account of His own will. And He heard the du'as and He responded. So we should have the same conviction that these men had when they prayed to Allah Azza wa Jalla. That He can do whatever He needs to do and wants to do. Wallahu a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك. السلام عليكم.